Hello and welcome to Money Matters TV. I'm your host, Doug Hepburn of Hepburn Financial Advisors, a boutique wealth management firm providing trusted advice to business owners, executives, and successful families in the Delaware Valley, located here in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. I'm joined by my co-host, Brad Mills, Vice President and Regional Manager for Shear Partners. Brad, how are you?
Doing great, Doug. It's a beautiful day.
That it is, and things have warmed up a lot. It seemed just last weekend it was freezing around here, and now we're battling summer. Got to turn the air conditioning on.
That's right. Happy to have the warm weather here for sure.
Exactly. Tell me what's new in your world.
Well, as you know, I've been on the job with Shear Partners here for about a month or so, setting up a regional office for us in central Pennsylvania. We focus on life sciences, medical properties, and industrial properties. So I've been meeting with a number of landlords and large property users and trying to find solutions that make sense for both sides.
Fantastic. I know you're right in like the corridor for logistics. And one of the things that we had talked about previously was one, the impact that home building has on the economy, because it's such a great multiplier. It creates so many jobs, not only in the materials end, but also in the construction end and beyond. But one of the really critical functions in that is the whole supply chain. And,
Yes.
where you are is a big, supply chain management is huge. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, sure. I mean, in focusing on the end user of the products for people building houses or for companies looking for new space, you have to give yourself a little extra time just because there are lingering supply chain issues. Just for example, I was talking today with a developer who's he probably has about 30 buildings in his portfolio. And he was saying that air conditioning units, rooftop air conditioning units, are still tough to get. There's still a much longer lead time than, maybe 2 months longer than previously anticipated. In addition, switchgear, and that's the gear that's used to bring the power in from the street into the building, also has a very long lead time. So what that means for a business that's moving to a new building or maybe people looking at a new home, to be built, you have to give yourself extra time. And hopefully, you've engaged professionals in your quest and, they help
Right.
you build your schedule. Right. So
Right.
It's a big issue.
It's interesting that you bring that up. I have a client located in Florida whose condo was damaged by one of the hurricanes, I think 2 years ago.
Ooh.
And they're still trying to get stuff done. In fact,
Really?
it took them over 8 weeks just to order the windows that they need to replace the windows in the condominium community. And it's not
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so it seems as though a lot of the supply chain issues that erupted from COVID and the subsequent mission by companies and Congress to sort of onshore a lot of those things that have been offshored is taking a lot longer than anybody anticipated. Would you say that's true?
I would. Onshoring is part of it, and it's just, I think, a general. You had real disruption with COVID, and
Right.
I think that the system's still catching up. Right, there was pent up demand, pent up supplies, but also pent up demand.
Right.
Certainly where I am in central Pennsylvania, obviously there are, there's 150 million square feet of industrial space. A lot of that is the newer high bay warehouses where Amazon and other companies are doing their fulfillment, throughout the Northeast. A lot of demand, spiked for this home delivery over COVID. These companies rushed to meet that demand. And so they put extra strains on those supplies, the air conditioning units, electrical equipment, and so on. So we're still kind of working through that. I think people just need to be aware that those problems aren't altogether gone.
Yeah, and not only that, but I mean, particularly in the residential market, you've got this excess demand and not for housing, and not enough supply coming onto the market because obviously a lot of people refinanced at low interest rates. They don't want to sell a house that's financed at 1.5% just to turn around and buy one that may be smaller or bigger at 6 or 7 or even 8% 30-year
Yes.
financing.
Yes.
So that's sort of restricted the amount of supply coming onto the market, and it's put a lot of pressure on the builders as well as
Yes.
of individual single family residential as well as multifamily. So it's really created some strains on the system.
No doubt. And the other is with remote working, you've seen population shifts. So people
Right.
moving from large major metropolitan areas like New York, let's say, or LA, Philadelphia to smaller areas. And so central Pennsylvania has been the beneficiary of that population growth. But I don't know that people anticipated it. So you're right. You've got to secure the land, get the entitlements, build the properties, and it just takes time. Couple that with the higher interest rates and higher costs for materials. The average price of a house has gone up. You're paying way more per square foot than you were pre-COVID, and that's a huge strain on people's budgets. It's a real issue.
Right. And that just feeds all the way down the line because you've got all these builders who are trying to meet the demand, but at the same time, they're putting strains on the manufacturers for all of the component parts. And so like a tidal wave, it just moves through all of those suppliers, and that's why it makes it critical for those supply chains to be shored up and managed properly.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we get viewer questions every month, and we had a viewer question from Grace Thomas of Philadelphia, who asked, "What are some common client questions when dealing with commercial real estate?"
Great question. I would say that time and money are the two big questions. Um, Business owners want to house their employees in the most advantageous way possible for their business. Let's just take an office user right now. People are working remotely. Business owners would probably like to see more people coming into the office because of all the benefits of collegiality and exchange of ideas. So they're rethinking their offices to make them more inviting. And people are trying different things, but what I'm seeing is an increase in say informal gathering areas. That's the best way to put it. Lounge areas where people can interact. I've seen those areas. Let's say they think about the company cafeteria might have been in the back of the building. Now it's more centrally located, so that say somebody going in to get a cup of coffee from one side of the building comes in and interacts with someone from a different department who might be on the other side of that. The idea is to create these sort of happy accidents where people can interact and exchange ideas and move the company's mission forward. So that's one particular issue. So I think that architects are having being asked more questions like this. How do I get my people to interact? What brings people into the office?
Right.
So obviously that's one thing. For the industrial user, say in my market or anywhere in the Northeast, there's a shortage of product. So let's say that you have a local distributor business distributing, I don't know, electrical equipment. Let's say your business has increased and you need to double your size. Okay, so now I'm going to go from 50,000 square feet to 100,000 square feet. Well, where are those spaces? In certain areas, you might have to go 20 miles to find 100,000 square feet, or you might have to build a building. So, those are the
Right.
questions too. Well, if I grow, where can I go, and how long is it going to take? How's it going to disrupt my operations? Some real existential questions for these businesses.
No, I can imagine. That makes a lot of sense. Well, if you have a question for Money Matters today, here's how you can submit it so we can answer it for you.
You can have your questions answered on Money Matters. Please go to our website, money-matterstv.com. On our homepage, click on the banner on the right that says Send Us Your Questions. While you're on our website, you can find information about our host and guests, as well as show notes and links about this show and past shows. Money Matters is also available as a podcast on iTunes and Stitcher, so you can listen to Money Matters while you're on the go. That website address, again, is money, M-O-N-E-Y, -matters, M-A-T-T-E-R-S, TV.com.
So in the last 2 years, the Federal Reserve has been increasing interest rates at a very rapid rate. Granted, they paused recently with the expectation that inflation is rolled over, but this dramatic increase in interest rates has had significant downstream effects on not only personal, corporate, but government finance. To help us make more sense of these impacts and how they're connected, we're joined by Paul Daneshrad, CEO and founder of StarPoint Properties, a real estate firm located in Beverly Hills, California. Welcome to Money Matters TV, Paul.
Doug, thank you. A pleasure being here.
You know, with all these, with interest rates as high as they are, it's created a lot of issues. You know, people not wanting to buy houses or not wanting to sell their house and buy another house at a higher interest rate. That just seems to be one of the things that we happen to talk about a lot on this program. But, you know, why are debts and deficits considered such a ticking time bomb? And what factors contribute to voters not supporting solutions on this issue?
Well, I mean, at the simplest, at the root issue, right? Everyone knows that too much debt is harmful, right? Whether that's personal or public or even as a business or even as a government, right? Eventually, too much debt kills. The question is, how much is too much? And, you know, as a nation, we just passed the really critical threshold of about 100% debt to GDP, which most experts, real experts, economists, both at the World Bank, even at the IMF, and actually even our Fed, you know, Jerome Powell just 2 or 3 weeks ago came out and said that our debt is such a big issue now that if we don't start having an adult conversation about it, it's going to lead to crisis. So our debts are going to lead us to crisis if we don't solve the problem, and we're not solving it. We're not even close to solving it. And so people need to prepare. And you're right, money matters. Money matters even more when there's going to be a debt crisis and you're not prepared. And most Americans are not.
Paul, let me follow up on that a little bit. What strategies can individuals adopt to avoid falling into the trap of consumerism? How can small changes in daily spending habits impact their financial well-being?
You're absolutely right, Brad. Consumerism is a disease in our country now. And we have been indoctrinated to consume and consume beyond our means, mainly through advertising. You know, the average person sees anywhere between 3,000 to 10,000 ads a day to consume. And consume things, a lot of things that they just don't need, that are not real necessities. And instead of that money going into savings and then investing, they just consume. And so don't buy anything you really don't need. Just find that discipline and control and put that money into your future and into your, you know, your safety net. And you're going to need that safety net. A debt crisis is coming. You know, I just mentioned Jerome Powell, but if you don't want to listen to the head of our Federal Reserve, listen to Jamie Dimon, who's one of the leading bankers and thinkers in the world and running one of the largest banks. And he said 3 weeks ago that the debt is going to be a real issue if we don't solve it, and it's going to lead to a debt crisis and maybe a banking crisis. And so we've got a lot of people warning us, but, you know, we're not listening. And one of the reasons we're not listening is the problem is so big. We've allowed this debt to keep compiling and growing for so many decades now that there's no easy fix, right? The solutions now require real sacrifice, real pain, And no one wants to go through that pain. So they keep kicking the can down the road. And they're like, well, I don't want this to be my problem. I want someone else to solve it. Can't come out of my pocket. And so that's just going to make the debt crisis even worse. And, so yes, people have got to start spending less, saving more, investing those dollars wisely. Einstein said that the eighth wonder of the world is the power of compounding, and especially when it comes to investing. So if you allow your money to compound and you keep investing and you keep rolling that over, it can be a lifesaver, especially in a debt crisis.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that got a couple of thoughts going in my mind. First off, you're absolutely right about what Einstein said, and the reality is that works both ways. When you have a debt crisis and things compound, that can work against you, particularly if you're not keeping up with your debt service, your interest payments. And with interest rates going up, I know there's a lot of concerns that the interest, the debt service, and this is just the interest on the money that the federal government's borrowed, is going to become an increasingly large portion of the annual budget that the government probably is going to have to raise taxes at some point in order just to keep up with that. And that not only does it crowd out investment, but it also means that the government has less dollars to spend on other things that are important to our security, like defense, like the Social Security, like some of the other things, the infrastructure that's necessary to keep the country running. Do you have any key principles that you'd like to share with people about investing?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is don't speculate. Investing takes time and patience. A lot of people want to get rich quickly and overnight, and to do that they speculate. Right. And all that ends up leading to is a loss of capital, very unlikely to lead to a growth of capital. So over the long term, if you invest wisely and you let it compound, then you're going to have savings and a real investment portfolio. So those are the two fundamentals, right? Patience and compounding. The third element of it is, if you're not an expert, then, rely on experts, but really select them wisely. I would tell you, most people can't, beat the markets, but some can. And so, you got to be thoughtful too, in regards to how you approach investing. And, coming back to being an expert, try to be an expert in something, right? Spend the time and spend the money on yourself, to educate yourself so that, you can be an expert. And there's this old, saying that, to be an expert in a specific field, it takes about 10,000 hours. And I think it's a good benchmark. So, investing in yourself is really a wise thing to do as well, especially with, the debt crisis that's coming. Having a real strong skill set is an asset.
Well, great points, Paul. And, I'm reminded of Warren Buffett, spending hours reading Standard & Poor's reports and analyzing companies, before he did any investments. And you mentioned this fiscal crisis coming, the debt crisis. What are some effective ways that people can safeguard their wealth in anticipation of this fiscal crisis coming to the U.S.?
So, I think the most important thing people can do is have a secondary source of income. Warren Buffett, since you quoted Warren Buffett, and he's one of my mentors, and I quote him a lot as well. he says, if you're not making money while you're sleeping, you're going to be working for the rest of your life. And what he really meant by that is everyone needs a secondary source of income. Everyone needs passive income. One, it's a good safety net, but it's also a good way to grow wealth. And there's a lot of ways to have that secondary source of income, but that's a real key component, so that when the debt crisis comes, and it's going to be really hard to predict when and how it unfolds, but you want to have that secondary source of income as a safety net. And so that's one thing I would really recommend people do. And it can be done, multiple ways to do it. One thing I would always recommend to people before you buy a house, which, is not a productive asset and it's an expense, I would buy, something where it has income for you, a secondary source of income, and it's a productive asset and it's not a liability and it doesn't have necessarily costs to it. Too many people go ahead and buy, because of the American dream, buy a home first, which again is a liability, before they, secure their future and start working on secondary sources of income or investments. So that's something else I would recommend. I'm teaching my kids really, at a young age, how important it is to save and invest and compound and set up that secondary source of income. All my children when they were in their teens had, 401ks or a Roth IRA, even though there was only $200 in it at the beginning when they were 14. But it taught them how to save and invest and how important it is, and started showing them at a young age the power of compounding. And so that's something else, like tax efficient vehicles that allow you to invest and let that money grow, tax deferred.
That your last comments just sparked a number of things in my mind, as well as the overall discussion that we've had. I mean, I've always told my clients, anytime you borrow money, you're spending future dollars because it's money that you haven't earned yet. You're spending next week's paycheck, if you will. So if you are going to incur debt, you got to make sure that it's good debt versus bad debt, meaning debt that's going to multiply. I mean, obviously, if you finance a machine or a piece of property that's going to generate revenue and income far in excess of your debt service, then it makes sense. But if you're just putting stuff on the credit card and letting it build up, that's the worst thing you can do. But and certainly educating your children is critical. They need to understand that. Unfortunately, we have a lot of adults that are like children and aren't really taking responsibility not only for their own personal finances, but also the government's finances, because nobody seems to realize that it's the politicians are the ones who are cutting these backdoor deals to sign these 1,500, 2,000 page omnibus reconciliation budgets just to sort of get the government funded instead of actually having the battles over what's really worth spending money on. And as citizens, we often continue to reelect these people just because they're bringing home the bacon for our community, as opposed to, or just because they got the right color. But instead of asking the hard questions about what are you doing for not only my future, but my children's future and my children's children's future, because they're the ones who are going to have to bear this debt, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. This is highly likely going to be a crisis that the next generation is going to have to pay for and solve. I don't think this is an immediate problem, meaning in the next 5 years. It's likely to transpire in the next 10 to 20. And because there's some time, because it's not an immediate threat, people have a tendency, what I call normalcy bias, to be like, oh,
Sure.
Well, that's a problem. It's not now. And, I don't want to worry about it. And if I have to pay for it, forget it. Right.
Right. Right.
So yes, we're putting the burden on our children and the next generation. And it's going to be an enormous burden because it just keeps on growing. And you're right. We've got too many of us in this country that are not acting like adults. The IRS came out with a statement a while back that says that about 15% of America doesn't have $2,000 in savings for a medical emergency.
Wow.
Right? And this was the IRS, right? So the IRS is looking at everyone's tax returns and knows,
Wow.
how much they've got in savings and how much they've got in cash. They've got more information almost than anybody. And so they reported, how come 50% of America doesn't have $2,000 for a medical emergency? That's irresponsible. It's just, as you said, Doug, it's just, adults not acting like, mature adults,
Right.
acting like children. Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's crazy. So Paul, you mentioned this economic downturn you see coming within the next, say, 10 to 20 years. And people should prepare, obviously. But what are the warning signs that indicate that downturn is coming? And what steps can individuals take beyond what you're mentioning to protect their financial stability during that particular time?
Brad, we should be real clear the difference between an economic downturn and a debt crisis. An economic downturn is a recession or a bad recession. Mm-hmm. A debt crisis is equivalent to a depression. We've never seen a debt crisis really in this country. The 2008 and 2009, which were, some people consider it a debt crisis, really wasn't. That was very, that was very specific to, the banking industry. It wasn't a real broad debt crisis, especially at the government level. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about a debt crisis. And so, so you said, what are one of the leading signs, right? So two of the leading thinkers on this, economists by the name of Reinhardt and Rogoff. One of them, economist from Harvard working at the World Bank, the other one working at the IMF. They wrote one of the leading research papers and books on this. The title of the book was This Time is Different.
This Time is Different. Yep. Excellent book.
Yeah, excellent book. And they went back and studied, the last 200 years, all the countries that had too much debt and ended up in some type of debt or monetary crisis. And they looked at what were the common themes, right? And what was an indicator that, was starting to show that a country was going to go into a debt or monetary crisis. And one of those metrics, which was, common amongst all the countries that experienced too much sovereign or national debt or government debt, was a debt to GDP ratio. And once countries got past 100% debt to GDP, that was an indicator that they went too far, and that eventually they led to a debt crisis. We've gone past 100% debt to GDP. We're now almost at 130%. That's an approximation. And, we're headed to 200% debt to GDP, right? We have annual deficits now that are the highest that we've seen in 30 years. Annual deficits every year.
You know what, Paul? That is scary stuff. And I wish people would take it as seriously as you do and as I do. And to quote one of my favorite economists, Arthur Laffer, no country in the history of the planet has taxed itself into prosperity. So we really have to cut our debt and deficit. Paul, I want to thank you very much for being our guest today and providing such great information for our viewers. Be sure to tune into our next show with Ben Rusk, CEO of Wisdom Wealth. Also, thank you, Brad, for co-hosting today. Most importantly, we want to thank our viewers for tuning into Money Matters TV, because right here is where your money matters.